Cátedra Internacional de Opinión Pública presenta The Role of the Polling in a Democratic Society. La Cátedra Internacional de Opinión Pública, WAP, da a ustedes la más cordial bienvenida a esta sesión del Seminario de Opinión Pública correspondiente al semestre enero-junio de 2021. Hoy la cátedra magistral lleva por título The Role of the Polling in a Democratic Society y estará a cargo de Michael Traugott, profesor investigador del Centro de Estudios Políticos de la Universidad de Michigan. Para iniciar este evento, cedemos la palabra al Dr. René Bautista, investigador del National Opinion Research Center, adscrito a la Universidad de Chicago.
¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes, bienvenidos todos a la cátedra, a esta presentación que tenemos el día de hoy. Estamos honrados con contar con la presencia del profesor Michael Traugott de la Universidad de Chicago. Él se especializa en estudios de campañas, elecciones, comportamiento electoral, comunicaciones políticas, en fin, es un destacado investigador reconocido mundialmente. Pero el equipo ha preparado un pequeño video, una pequeña introducción en donde vamos a presentar un poco su trayectoria y eventualmente regresaremos con él para que nos haga favor de hacer la presentación de lo que ha preparado para hoy el profesor, y posteriormente a su presentación abriremos la ronda de preguntas y respuestas. Así que mientras ocurre todo esto, los invito a que vayan pensando en sus preguntas. Adelante, por favor, equipo, con el video presentando al profesor Traugott.
Michael Traugott, a professor emeritus of communication studies and political science at the University of Michigan, is a political scientist by training who studies campaigns and elections, voting behavior, political communication, the use of polls to construct news, and survey methodology. He has published extensively in all of these areas, and for several years, he was a Gallup senior scientist. He is active in the American Association for Public Opinion Research and the World Association for Public Opinion Research, having served as president of both organizations. In 2010, he received the APOR Award for Exceptionally Distinguished Service, and in 2016, he received the Helen Dinerman Award from WAPOR for Lifetime Achievement. He is a frequent resource for journalists interested in discussing American political campaigns and government operations.
Thank you for that introduction. Mike, it's a pleasure having you here today with the Cátedra Internacional. It's an effort by colleagues in order to promote knowledge and expansion of what we do in the industry of survey research. It's really an honor to have you here. So thank you for accepting the invitation, and the microphone is all yours.
Thank you very much, Renee, and I appreciate very much being invited to make this presentation. I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to work through. Great, and I assume that you can see this now.
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm going to talk about this very broad topic of the role of polling in a democratic society. And I'm going to approach the subject in a variety of ways that I think are useful and relevant. I'm going to begin with just a very brief history of polling and some critical events, and then talk about the association between public opinion polling and election coverage. There are a lot of polls, obviously, that are conducted between elections, and actually, one of the most important functions of polling with regard to a democratic society are those polls that don't relate to campaigns, but relate to issues of the day. I'm going to talk a little bit then about changes in data collection and reporting styles. I think it's important to emphasize the role of news organizations in sponsoring polls and disseminating the results. And then I'm going to talk about some issues in conveying poll results, and then some issues in consuming poll results. And then I'm going to conclude by talking about political polarization and its impact on the consumption of poll results, and therefore on a democratic society. So this photograph is of the people that we think of in the United States, and I think generally in the world, as the founders of the public polling business. There were individuals conducting polls before these three individuals became so prominent. And I'll introduce them first of all. On the left is George Gallup. In the middle is Elmo Roper, and on the right is Archibald Crossley. And this picture is taken from a meeting in the 40s. And one trait that these three individuals had in common was they were interested in developing a commercial business, but they understood that in order to attract clients, they needed to have some visibility for their organization. And each of them worked with a specific media organization in order to gain visibility, and therefore as a way indirectly to build their business. So George Gallup, as I will tell you a little bit more in a minute, had a contract with Washington Post for the 1936 election. Elmo Roper had an arrangement with Fortune magazine. And Archibald Crossley worked with the Literary Digest and then with the audience research organization, Radio Audience Research Organization. They conducted polls, usually through syndication, presented their results. And then as their firms developed visibility, they also built their client base. George Gallup was a little different than the other two in that he had a PhD. He had been to graduate school and in journalism. He was very interested in newspaper readership initially, although he did surveys for his mother-in-law who ran for office in Iowa. And he was probably the best read of the three in the ways that an academic at least would think about this. And he actually was a college professor for a little while. And so he was able to talk and speak publicly about a role for polls in public life and in support of the government. He talked about public polls as a measure of the will of the people. And he emphasized the fact that campaigns were very important and elections obviously were important in terms of selecting members of a government to represent the people, but elections only occurred periodically. And so there should be a way, which he had worked on for his doctoral thesis, to measure opinions and distribute opinions broadly, because in this quote from his book that he authored with Saul Ray. He said, public opinion is, quote, the reserve force in democratic politics that can play its part only if the common run of people are continually encouraged to take an interest in the broad lines of public policy, in their own opinions, and in those of their fellows, and if clear channels exist through which these opinions can become known. So what Gallup and Ray were talking about was not only the appropriate methodology for collecting information through polls, but also having a means of dissemination of the results so that people could learn what their fellow citizens were thinking about topics of the day. And 1948 was a difficult time for the polls. These are two public assessments of Gallup and his work. One of them is from Time magazine right after the polling disaster in 1948, and another is something published by Esquire just before the time of his death. So Time is commenting after this problem with the 1948 polls, which I'll mention in a minute. The argument over whether public opinion polls are good or bad for a democracy has become somewhat academic. They are obviously here to stay. They can find out what the people think, who rule a democracy, think and want. They can find out what the people who rule a democracy think and want. And then as he neared the end of his life, Esquire commented, before Gallup, democracy was an exercise in guesswork. Letters from constituents, the results of infrequent elections. Elected officials can now feel the public pulse more accurately, and one might assume they have become more sensitive to the voters' wishes. And of course, Dr. Gallup passed away in 1984, almost one generation ago. And there's been a lot of change, not only in the polling industry, but also in the ways in which the public consumes polls. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the rest of my presentation. But I wanted to emphasize the centrality and the visibility of George Gallup in setting the scene for the way we think about polling today. The use of polls by news organizations has been centralized around elections. And this plays a very important role in the public's assessment of polls and the polling industry. Elections are newsworthy because, of course, first of all, they're a central element of democracy. If you have a representative government, a representative democratic government, that means that periodically and on a regular basis, these individuals either stand for re-election or there is what we call an open contest where people are contesting for a seat. These elections occur on a schedule. That is, there's an election day and there could be a limit on the campaign period. We don't have that in the United States, but I know that in many countries there is such a limit. And therefore, from a news organization's perspective, they can plan for their coverage, they can budget their resources, and this makes it very efficient for them to provide such coverage, and in conjunction with that, to conduct polls. Elections involve visible figures, the candidates themselves, other elites who are thinking about the big issues of the day, and they are willing to be quoted, which are two important attributes. They don't have to, the people who are quoted often don't have to be identified by office or location, and the fact that they can provide a quote is very important to the construction of a news story. And the other thing that's important and makes elections newsworthy is that they have a clear resolution. The votes are counted, a winner is declared, a loser is acknowledged, and the news organization can go on to other topics. In the very contemporary United States, this is the first instance in which somebody's arguing that we don't have a clear resolution, but all of the legal matters have been resolved, and that's what is relevant to the newsworthiness of elections. So, because of this interest of news organizations in covering elections, they have always been interested in what the public is thinking about the candidates in the campaign. So it's possible to go back into very early in the 19th century, and we think that perhaps the first publicly disseminated information about a contest occurred in 1824 in a straw poll in the Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams race. What we mean by a straw poll is not a sampling of individuals, but the use of labeled products. It could have been bales of straw. It could have been boxes of popcorn. It could have been any other commodity that could have been packaged in different colors or with different labeling. And based upon the relative sales of these goods, an estimate was made of who was the candidate with the highest level of support in the public. This obviously is very unsystematic and can produce biased results. In the 20th century, there were a number of efforts to begin to contact large numbers of individuals. And the magazine called the Literary Digest began in 1916 to conduct a national poll by mailing postcards to individuals whose addresses they could obtain from voter registration lists or vehicle license registrations, and so on. There was a risk in this method when you think generally about who would be registered or who had the means to buy an automobile. And this was a lead that got George Gallup interested in the quality of the Literary Digest methodology compared to some of the methods that he'd been working with regard to sampling and asking, administering a questionnaire to individuals. And so as he began his business, he had left academia and joined Young and Rubicam. He also formed a company called the American Institute for Public Opinion Research, IPO. He struck a deal with the Washington Post that said that he could do a better job than the Literary Digest in estimating the outcome of the 1936 election, or they wouldn't have to pay him. It turned out that his estimate was good. He made two estimates, really. How far off the Literary Digest would be, that estimate was quite good. He underestimated the support for Franklin Roosevelt, but he suggested that Roosevelt would win, which of course he did. And this catapulted Gallup into high public visibility and got his business started, off and running as well. He did quite well, and the other pollsters did generally until the 1948 election. And this was a major issue. They estimated that Dewey would defeat Truman. This is Harry Truman holding up a Chicago Daily Tribune with a premature headline on the newspaper the day after the election. And the Social Science Research Council brought together a committee to investigate the sources of these errors. And we think that part of this was due to sampling and the use of quota sampling, but it was also due to stopping interviewing prematurely and not continuing to interview through the campaign. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, about these issues of methodology. But this is important because from a pollster's perspective, there are few things that we measure that have such external validation as the result of an election. And so the image of the entire industry is based upon the quality of estimates produced by the pre-election polls. If you think about the concept of consumer confidence, for example, which is measured in surveys, and which involves the combination of responses to a series of questions, there is no external measure of consumer confidence. It doesn't exist except by what the people who do survey research or polling tell the public consumer confidence is. So the accuracy of the pre-election polls is critical to public trust in the polls themselves, but also in relation to beliefs that citizens have about the role of polls. It's also important in relation to trust in government. So let me just say a couple of things about the nature of the polling business. At the very beginning, in using Gallup still as an example, Gallup would conduct a monthly poll by mailing questionnaires out to the field. There were supervisors who then redistributed them to interviewers who conducted the interviews using, again, as I said, quota samples. The information was sent back to his headquarters in Princeton. The printed questionnaires were converted to analyzable data, and Gallup produced 2 columns a week, and he syndicated this information to newspapers. Everybody got the same information. In the 1960s, news organizations began to, sorry, I can't turn my own phone off. News organizations organized to begin to collect their own data. And again, with these newsworthiness criteria in mind, they were asking questions like, why do we have to rely on George Gallup or Lou Harris's assessment of what the important issues of the day are? Because that's the questions that they ask, right? We should be able to write our own instruments. And we should be able to determine when the survey should be able to go into the field. So news organizations began to conduct their own sponsored polls. And then with the development and fragmentation in a way of the news business, newspapers and television networks combined forces to collect data. So we started with CBS News and the New York Times, and then the Washington Post and ABC News, and so on. And nowadays, of course, we have websites that are the news organizations have their websites, but we have websites that independently collect polls. And again, the justification here is we ought to be able to decide what the important issues are. We ought to be able to frame them in our questions and with our own response categories, and to collect and disseminate the data on our own schedule. And I want to say just a little bit about the history of polling methods and how they've changed over time, especially with technology. So in this example that I told you about with Gallup, he was using a geographically based sample at a national level, and he was conducting personal interviews, which replaced mail surveys, which is the term I use to describe the postcard system of the Literary Digest, right? So we had mail out, mail back. Then we had centrally distributed to geographical areas. And the field period for one of these surveys was about a month, or the production for data collection was about a month. After the 1948 election, there was a discussion among academics and among the public pollsters about ways to improve the methods for data collection. And there was a general switch from probability sampling as a replacement for quota sampling. There are two key issues associated with any poll, as I'm sure most of you know. One of them is the way in which the concepts that are being measured are converted into specific question wordings and the errors that might be associated with doing that poorly, but also the question of the representativeness of the people who are asked the questions. And that was the major contention between probability sampling and quota sampling. We had the penetration of landline telephones after the war, and a switch to telephone interviewing, which would replace in-home interviewing and gave the pollster more control over the data collection. And then in the 1970s, with the development and dissemination or distribution of personal computers. Sorry if I'm using too many acronyms here. Personal computers. This enabled the development of computer-aided telephone interviewing techniques, CADI, computer-aided personal interviews, CAPI, and random digit dialing samples. And one of the reasons that the New York Times and CBS News formed this partnership was because there was a lot of methodological expertise at CBS News, but the New York Times had a classified advertising department that was a large series of desks, all of which had a telephone on them, and they weren't being used in the evening. And the best time to contact people for interviews was late in the afternoon into the evening. And so they each supplied their own set of resources. We have, and of course, the next issue technologically was the advent and penetration of cell phones, and a methodological question became the proportion of cell phones as opposed to landline phones that would be included in the sample. Mail survey techniques were improving all through this period. For some people, using an address-based sample, they believe provides greater representation, especially in a period of declining response rates, lower response rates. And now, of course, there are many organizations that are recruiting people to panels on the internet through email that they can send web questionnaires to. And there's a lot of variance in these methods, and all volunteer sample can be problematical. Some firms are recruiting people with telephone interviews, and if they don't have a computer to do surveys subsequently, they supply them with a tablet and maybe with internet access. These issues of telephones and internet access all affect the representativeness of the respondents in the sample and who can be interviewed. One thing that has changed a little bit over time and has had a consequence for news production is that we have known, communication scholars have known for some time that news organizations have a tendency to use campaign metaphors of the dynamics of the campaign to provide what we call horse race coverage, who's ahead and who's behind, who's catching up, who's falling behind. And this is amplified by a reliance on what we call the trial heat question. If the election were held today and Donald Trump were the Republican candidate and Joe Biden were the Democratic candidate, who would you vote for? But there's also been an advent of statistical modelers they don't actually collect survey data themselves. They don't do polling, but they assemble poll results and they combine them into models to estimate either the outcome nationally or state by state, and then in the American context, adding up the electoral votes. And since 2012, the Obama-Romney election, a language has emerged in the coverage of campaign that talks about paths to victory. And this is a visualization of the result, essentially, of computer simulations about the likelihood of Obama winning and the likelihood of Romney winning. That is, how many paths to victory does each candidate have? And so in this particular visualization, you can see that Barack Obama had about 6 times as many paths to win as Romney, and this gets added into the way the campaign is covered. And this is important because political scientists talk about electability and viability, and the candidate who is more electable, seen as more electable, tends to get more coverage and more positive coverage than the candidate who is behind. This is also related to how much money they can raise, how many volunteers they can get, and so on. So with that as the background, now I'm going to turn more directly to the question of the role of polls in a democratic society. What does the public and elected officials expect from polls? How do citizens react to polls? And how does this affect trust in polls and therefore in the political system? Elected officials have, of course, many sources of information to guide them in developing or designing legislation or new policies. And while polls can be an important source of information for them, they have other sources of information at their disposal, including from interested and knowledgeable elites, interest groups, lobbyists, and so on. It's also true that communication from constituents and other kinds of organized campaigns, for example, energized by lobbyists, may not be representative of the general public views. And so well-conducted polls can provide a counterweight or a counterbalance to that. From research conducted starting in the 1970s, we know that the public has 2 interests in poll results. First of all, they want to learn what their fellow citizens think about issues. You could think about this as a kind of a horizontal communication function among citizens, but they're also interested in polls as a way of communicating preferences to elected leaders, a kind of a vertical communication dimension that's more related to seeing their preferences enacted into law or to policy. And trust in the political system is related to a belief that the public's preferences and needs are being considered by the government, that they're not being disregarded. A key group in this communication process, though, is journalists, who generally aren't very well trained in polling methodology. They can't evaluate the quality of a poll. And so often we find ourselves as responsible to people who are reporting on public opinion who can't make very good assessments of whether the data are good quality or not, or reliably reported. So we've learned a fair amount since then about public attitudes about polls. And I just want to say something quickly about how do we learn about how the public thinks about polls? And the answer is we use survey-based experiments. They might involve something called vignettes, and they might involve visual stimuli. I'm going to show you something about this in a moment. We can't make these assessments in the abstract. So we present a survey respondent with a story. It could have been read to them on the telephone. It could have been presented to them as a visual stimulus on a web survey. And in this work that goes in the early work, we used a series of items to construct two different scales. One of them is an interest in others' opinions, and it involved these 5 items. Polls are a good way for me to learn what other people are thinking. The prediction of a pollster, pollsters add to the excitement of a political campaign. And the second was a government attention to poll scale. Do you think opinion polls have too much or too little influence on Washington? People in government pay too much attention to opinion polls when making new policies. Using a particular statistical technique, we were able to construct these 2 scales. And one interesting thing was that the 2 scales are relatively independent. They're uncorrelated. So a person's interest in others' opinions is not necessarily highly correlated with their the attention they think that the government should pay to polls. One interesting finding from this study is that substantial portions of the public did not feel that elected officials should pay attention to poll results in deciding on laws related to specific issues when we control for a number of other personal characteristics. In other words, this notion imbued in political theory about the aggregation of citizen preferences up to policy or law is not a widely held view in the public. Some people believe that their views are more important than others, is another way to describe this. And this attitude about how the government should respond to poll results is unrelated to knowledge of polling methods. That is, people who knew more about the details of polling weren't more likely or less likely to say this. But individuals who had more personal resources, more information, higher levels of education, higher levels of political knowledge, were more likely to express this reservation. And this line of research developed over time, and we have now developed a better appreciation of what I would call the problem of human nature. There are 2 different models that are common, prevalent, to describe how people process and consume new information. One of them is that they have a position or some level of knowledge, they get new information, and they just update their current knowledge. Another model called motivated reasoning says that when people are confronted with new information, when they're exposed to new information, they look at it with regard to what they already know or believe. And because of the theory of cognitive dissonance, if it's contrary to what they believe, they argue against it. They counter-argue conflicting information. This is the theory of motivated reasoning. And it's possible to test these competing possibilities, as I said, with vignettes and visual stimuli. And I'm going to show you just very quickly how we do this. We've done this in experiments. On the left side of the screen, you see a shot of a contrived poll result about the contest between Trump and Clinton in 2016. And you see in the middle a graphic with the results of the poll, a relatively tight race, but in this case showing Clinton's ahead. We have done work like this in Mexico with my collaborators Alejandro Moreno and Rosario Aguiar. And we are now analyzing data that we have collected in the United Kingdom. And these results, and on the right, you see 2 stimuli that we presented visually in a web survey in the UK. And these results about motivated reasoning and the impact of high levels of resources are consistent for both polls related to policy. So the top picture on the right shows simulated findings from a poll about attitudes towards the National Health Service in the UK, that they are doing well or doing badly. And you can see the two versions, which are exactly the same, but reversed, right? We also took this measurement for Boris Johnson, for support for Boris Johnson. And the way that we make these evaluations is we ask generally 3 questions, which we can use to form an index. How informative do you think this poll is? How accurate do you think this poll is? How reliable do you think this poll is? And here in the graphic, these are results, right? So the y-axis is the proportion of respondents who think that the poll is more accurate, right? And the 2 bars on the left are for Republicans, and they are more likely to think that the poll is accurate when it shows Trump in the lead. That's the high red bar. And on the right, among Democrats, you can see that the blue bar is higher in a poll showing Clinton in the lead. This is an example of the effect of partisanship on interpretation of a set of poll results. One of the things that complicates further these findings in the United States in the contemporary period is the implication of polarization. That is the fact that Republicans and Democrats are increasingly seeing things as different. And so this is an exit poll response to a question about whether you have a favorable opinion of both parties, of only Democrats, only Republicans, or neither. And it's analyzed by party. And you can see that Democrats, people who say both parties are more likely to be Democrat, or only Democrats are very likely to be Democrats. Only Republicans, though, it is only the Republicans, 96% of Republicans who think that they only have who say that they only have a favorable opinion of Republicans. So this is one indication of the impact of polarization on assessments of party members. These are the results from another question asked in 2 Pew surveys. It's not a very common question, but asking people whether they prefer that their child marry someone from the same party. And you can see that in 1958, when they asked this question for the first time, a third of Democrats said they did, and a quarter of Republicans did. But in 2016, these proportions have now risen to 60% and 63% respectively. So the dislike of partisans from the other party, from the other side of the fence, has increased the complications of looking at poll results and assessing them in a neutral fashion as opposed to a partisan fashion. And we have this problem in the United States where the Congress, especially the Senate, is not taking up very much legislation. There's a lot of talk about bipartisanship, although Democrats and Republicans have different views about who's going to help the other out. But Joe Biden, President Biden, is trying to redefine bipartisanship according to polls. He is proposing legislation that he can cite support for among both Democrats and Republicans to try to get the Congress, especially the Senate, to move. So in addition to expressing policy positions, Biden is trying to use poll results to influence elite behavior in the legislature. This hasn't worked yet, but he continues to make this argument. I think it's probably designed primarily to try to embarrass the Republicans for continually saying no, but he's using polls to demonstrate popular support for actions that he wants to take. So let me say in summary, motivated reasoning is a very powerful model to explain the assessments that people have of polls, especially their ability to discount the results. This says a number of important things about how effective it might be to try to educate the public about polling methods, because increasing knowledge about how polls are conducted doesn't seem to affect how people assess these experimental results to which we expose them. And maintaining trust in government and its responsiveness to the public will is also a complicated situation if the public thinks that legislatures or individual elected leaders are not responding to poll results as they're published. So this has consequences for public perceptions of pollsters and of politicians and of the results that they present, especially through the media. And we know that the role of polls in a democratic society is changing, in that, at least in the United States, the government doesn't seem to be as responsive as it's been in the past, or as the public thought they might be. And this is an area that we will have to continue to study. So that is my presentation. I will stop sharing, and Renee is going to moderate comments and questions.
Thank you, Mike. Very interesting presentation. Appreciate all the great points that you have presented today. Just let's start with questions from the public. We have different channels. In the same Zoom link, we have members from the Cátedra Internacional, and other members from the public are following this presentation through YouTube and Facebook Live, and they might be able to send questions from you. And just to say this also in Spanish, si ustedes gustan enviar preguntas para el presentador a través de los diversos canales en los cuales están siguiendo esta transmisión, por favor siéntanse con la libertad de hacerlo, ya sea en inglés o en español. Si son en español, haré mi mejor esfuerzo para traducirlo para Mike Traugott. Bueno, comencemos con los miembros de la cátedra. Vi que el doctor Lauro Mercado ha indicado que quiere hacer una pregunta. Adelante, Lauro, por favor.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rene. Thank you very much, Michael. It's always a pleasure to hear you. Although my question is not maybe the most important regarding the central issue that you exposed about the difficulty among for this conversation and for the objectivity that people may have to read polls objectively, but still I would like to make it, if you can tell us something, because there is a very big debate right now in Mexico regarding precisely the validity of different methods of data collection. Specifically, there is the orthodox side, in which I could say I belong, where if you don't have a probabilistic sample, either with telephones or mainly face-to-face interviews, and you use for public opinion web panels or bots, etc., you are not going to have a representation of the opinions. But, and I believe that you shared this position. But then I heard that you did some research in UK using a web sample, a web survey. So this shocked me a little bit, and my question is, what's your position on this debate, methodological debate?
So, my position has been changing a little bit over time in the following way. I used Gallup, as the basis for, extending my comments. And in the early days of survey research, when we had a reasonably good sample and we had a high response rate, the standard theory of probability sampling, margin of error, and so on applied very well. But we haven't been in that circumstance for quite a while. I would say maybe more than 20 years. In the following sense, for a commercial pollster, so I didn't talk much about I don't want to get down into the weeds too much, but I didn't talk about other pressures on news organizations to collect data. Most of the data that the public sees comes from news polls, media polls, and they have used technology to reduce the field periods to 48 or 72 hours. And that's important because things change in the world rapidly. They don't want to collect data and have them invalidated by some event in the real world. The president makes a speech or there's a new ad in a campaign and so on. So the response rates in commercial polls are now probably in the US in single digits under those conditions. So they're not making contact with more than 9 out of 10 people they contact, right? So compared to the Gallup and the data collection in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, where the model was collect data from respondents and aggregate them simply to a total, right? We now have very heavily statistically modeled results. Some of it is as simple as weighting procedures and post-stratification. In the case of pre-election polls, it's more complicated than that because there are likely voter models, right? And every pollster thinks they have their own sort of secret sauce for combining respondents to estimate the electorate, right? So first of all, we have to acknowledge that the simple aggregation model is long gone, and that all of the results that we see are to a greater or lesser extent statistically adjusted. So now I think the question has turned to how adequate are those adjustment methods? And first of all, that requires a level of transparency that's important, but which we don't always see. And an evaluation of those methods is only for the most sophisticated methodologists, not for the average citizen. The average citizen has to take the presented findings at face value. Now, that may involve more risk now than it did 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, right? Because it's not the simple aggregation of a good sample with a high response rate. So I'm increasingly interested in these alternative methods, but especially the details of how they're applied, so that I can make a judgment or an assessment about whether I think it's a good method or not. I'm not sure if that was too long an answer, and it's not it's not a direct answer, but I think we have to make an accommodation to the realities of contemporary data collection.
Thank you. Deeply interesting for me. And
Yeah.
for my colleagues, I'm sure.
Thank you both, Laura, for the question and Mike for the answer. We have a question from Ricardo de la Peña from Facebook, and the question translates into something like, considering the increasing complexity in survey research methods, what would we need to do to help educate reporters, journalists, and the public in general to provide them with tools for assessment of methods?
Well, you know, this is a set of questions that I've been interested in for most of my career. I think that the most important thing, first of all, is to focus on the training of the journalists. Because the journalists are gatekeepers of the dissemination of poll results. And one thing that would be very important to do would be to train journalists not to write stories about some data. That is, they need to make an evaluation of the face validity of the data, some assessment of the methods that are used, and then to decide whether to write at length or not. The groups that have it, you know, I think of, I'll use a newspaper example, but it's also true of homepages. I think of the front page of the newspaper as the result of a contest every day for who can make it there. And some groups and individuals have learned that holding a press conference about a new poll release, a new set of data, will increase their odds of getting to the front page or, you know, onto the homepage. So we have examples of poorly conducted surveys, biased question wording, unrepresentative samples, resulting in a press release, then a press conference, and the distribution of the press release to the journalists. And generally, you know, if you talk about the vast majority of media, those journalists don't have the ability to discriminate between good data and bad, and whether to write about it or not. But I think that that's critical. It's much more complicated to think about what to do about citizens and their ability to comprehend or analyze or discriminate among different poll results because they have less training than journalists, and they don't also have a responsibility to learn much about the methods. In the case of the United States, in general, our civics education has declined, you know, starting in middle schools and high schools. And it's also true, I think, of some of our college curriculum as well. And the work that we've done recently, my work with Ozan Kuru and Josh Pasek, suggests that knowledge of polling methodology is not a sufficient counteraction to this motivated reasoning process. Even when we, in the vignettes, the experiments that we used, we inserted a quote from someone who was described as an expert. So overcoming the need to reduce cognitive dissonance is a major issue that we haven't figured out how to deal with yet. It's not a very positive response, but I believe, based on this research, that's where we stand currently.
Thank you, Mike, for your answer. We have now a question from Luis Guerrero. Luis, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Dr. Traugott, it's such a pleasure having you here. I'm such a fan of yours. And I've enjoyed your work on the SAGE handbook and also on the Oxford Handbook of American Public Opinion Research. So building a little upon what my colleague was asking 2 questions ago, here in Mexico, we're used to conduct our surveys face-to-face, but this has been problematic now more than ever since the pandemic as well. But we do not have very good access to panel surveys yet. So thinking about emerging methods and in your experience, how these methods have contributed to aiding pollsters that are relying on their accuracy for face-to-face interviews. So which methods would you say would be more appropriately here in Mexico for us to get our focus on? Which would you think they have more future for us, being a country that has a limited coverage on internet, which is growing, and also on phone infrastructure, which also is rather good, but not that accurate as well. And given that technology has developed in recent years, things like big data and eye tracking, neuroscience, and chatbots, all these virtual reality and things that might solve or not some of the problems we have with face-to-face increasingly. What would your take be on this?
Well, listening to your question, I'm going to loop back to the answer I gave earlier first. In just a slight way, but for emphasis. Survey research methods are not static and don't apply to all circumstances. The same methods don't apply to all circumstances, right? We have to, survey methodology is an applied science. It means it has to be appropriate to the circumstances. And we're just learning about ways to combine data. So, for example, I've been doing some work. We did some work with Gallup in the 2016 election, in which they asked open-ended questions. What have you seen, read, or heard about Donald Trump in the last couple of days? Hillary Clinton. And then we have continued that with CNN in the 2020 campaign. And we have done, my colleagues have done some natural language processing of open-ended responses in relation to questions that we asked about favorability of the candidates and so on. I think of this as experimental, but very interesting and with, a lot of potential. It's in the process, I think, of redefining what a media effect is. In the classic communication studies, we would ask people which newspapers they read, which television networks they watched, and so on, maybe an estimate of how often or how much. But that ignored, first of all, conversations they had with people, the content of conversations. And of course, it didn't account at all for social media interactions, Twitter posts or Facebook posts that were shared or read or whatever. So, but when we ask a general question, have you read, heard, or seen anything about Joe Biden in the last couple of days? That captures a sense of information, content, and flow that they've received from almost any source, right? So research on the connection between those open-ended responses and the closed-ended questions that we receive is very important. Also, the results of the surveys compared to, for example, an analysis of a random sample of tweets that contain Joe Biden's name is also useful. But I think I mentioned in my presentation that people who collect data have two central issues. One of them is the validity and the reliability of the measurements they make. And then the second is the representativeness of the units from which they get the data, right? So we know that, for example, Facebook is ubiquitous virtually in the United States, and maybe a quarter or 30% of the people use Twitter. So immediately you have a representativeness issue. We don't have enough data in which we have collected standard, more or less standard survey measures from people who gave us their Twitter handle, and we can analyze their tweets to see how that content relates to the answers they give to the surveys, either closed-ended questions or open-ended questions, right? So that's one thing we need. Another thing we need is there's a lot of, this is a complication of doing polls for news organizations. There are a lot of interesting ways to collect data, but aren't very rapid. And I think that one understudied area is related to mode effects. You know, there's an increasing emphasis on multi-mode surveys. And most of that research is related to essentially format consequences of modes. Does the question look different? Do the response alternatives look different on a cell phone, for example, compared to a web screen, or right? But I think the understudied part of this is sample composition. Do we get different samples? The representation of men and women, levels of education, levels of income, when we interview on a cell phone, on a tablet, on a landline, or face-to-face. So when we observe differences, how much of it is due to format, but how much of it is due to the composition of the sample? That is actually only the first part of the problem, because if you do a multi-mode survey, the next issue is, how do I combine the parts? And I don't think we know enough about that yet already. These are interesting questions that could be subject to what I would call sensitivity analysis, which is like the equivalent of, what difference does it make if I have in my final sample 60% cell phone, 50% cell phone, 25% cell phone, right? This analysis also takes time and reduces the point at which we could release results. Again, for academics, you know, these are fascinating questions, and from our perspective, we have all the time in the world. But if we're collecting data about current policy issues or about a current campaign, you know, that's a real constraint. I don't know if that's too long and complicated an answer, which doesn't actually prove to be definitive, but I think that these are very important issues, especially in places where they're still conducting face-to-face interviews, because we're doing relatively little of that in the United States, except for studies that have very substantial government funding.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis, for the question, and Mike for the answer. Are there questions from the Cátedra members here on Zoom before we check on our media channels? I'm not seeing hands. Let me check our channels. I'm not seeing questions here. All right, so I have a question for you, Mike. And it's sort of follow up on what you were discussing in this most recent answer. I mean, one of the aspects that we've seen in 2020 is precisely, trying to quickly be responsive to the situation that we lived in the past year. And in that regard, we saw a lot of survey studies who needed to quickly pivot to, whatever was available to do to them to conduct studies because of the public health crisis, the pandemic, etc.
Yeah.
What did you see? What did we change fundamentally in our industry that can give us insights as to where we're going as an industry? We saw people mixing web, phone, other ways of collecting data and trying to come up with estimates on what was happening out there. Do you think that any of what we saw in 2020 is going to have a more permanent presence in the way we conduct survey research in the future?
Well, I'm pretty sure that the ways that we collect data will change. And that's because of the inevitable cost pressures that anybody who collects data faces, right? And that I think is the fundamental issue that is pushing us, collectively, to mixed mode data collection. Because we know that slightly oversimplified, we know that by some modes, it's easier and less costly to collect data, but it comes with problems of representation. And so then we have to supplement our methods with additional, more costly data collection methods. It's just like the problem of, in the United States, of doing telephone surveys, but the cost of a cell phone interview is twice as great as the cost of a landline, because our laws say that you can't dial a cell phone by computer. It has to be dialed by hand. So I think it'll depend on, first of all, it'll depend upon the topic and about the sponsor and the need for timely analysis and presentation of results. But I think that we're also, people who are, social scientists, data collectors, are also rethinking data sources. And you can imagine, and so that's the advantage potentially of big data, where now we're not talking about interviews, but essentially other kinds of observational data, more like administrative records, right? So that if we're interested in explanations or models for traffic accidents, and as cars become filled with electronics that communicate with each other and also record things that are going on in the car, right? For some kinds of behavior, we'll have new and different ways to analyze relationships. It will require a different set of skills, which would include software, ability to code, ability to deal with such large quantities of data, quantities that we're not familiar with currently as survey researchers. One of the main problems will be trying to develop explanations that take personal characteristics into account, where, for example, in the car accident case, we know something about the car and about the conditions. We don't know who the driver was. And so how do we impute or infer the characteristics of the driver in that instance it could be from looking at other sources like vehicle registrations or information about who resides at a particular address, but that in itself will involve large-scale combinatorial data management tasks, right? We can do this, especially in multi or interdisciplinary teams, right? That involve computer scientists and social scientists. But it's going to be time consuming, expensive, and we're not yet in a position where we can produce these results quickly.
Thank you, Mike. That's very interesting, and certainly I think that's what the future seems to look at this point. And I wonder if some of that is going to be at odds with other agendas coming from confidentiality, security, ethical issues that probably we haven't fully discussed as an industry. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, we also, I think that's very important, but we also have, speaking as a social scientist, we also have different standards than computer scientists. You may have read a story in the last few months about Facebook taking the University of Minnesota, shutting down all the University of Minnesota sites associated with Facebook, because a computer scientist wanted to test an algorithm and installed it in a variety of users of certain Facebook sites. The computer scientist thought this was an experiment, and he didn't really care who these people were. On the other hand, it violated the norms of informed consent. And if you spend, I have no idea who this person was. If you spend most of your life in the formation of algorithms, and you have no idea who's using the algorithm because it's not material to your design of the algorithm, right? This is a very serious piece of information and a very serious problem. It does present problems for survey researchers because we promise our respondents confidentiality and anonymity, but there are risks associated with merging the survey data with other kinds of data, and therefore raising the possibility of subsequent links to other data files that could identify the person. This is a problem with the use of Twitter, where if you had enough computing power and you searched for the content of a specific quote out of a tweet, you could identify the person who made that tweet. So these are things that we're just beginning to consider as part of the work we do alone, and also in collaboration with others who also have different training and background in these kinds of issues.
Thank you, Mike. Certainly, that's a topic that is going to keep us busy for the foreseeable future. Let me check if there are other questions from our channels, or if there are questions from the Cátedra members. All right, so I'm checking. I'm seeing lots of congratulatory words for you, Mike. People excited on your presentation. Thank you. Okay, I'm not seeing other questions. Let me check here with people on Zoom if they have questions for our presenter.
Would you be kind enough to share your presentation with us?
Yes, I've already agreed to do that.
Okay.
And the Cátedra has a copy of my slides.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. I have a question here from Laura. Go ahead, Laura.
Yes, profiting of the opportunity. You mentioned this issue regarding the natural language processing, the problem of representativity, because only a quarter of the population has it in face of Facebook. But haven't there been done this kind of analysis with Facebook in order to avoid this problem? I mean, not natural language processing with Facebook information, with Facebook web scraping or extraction,
Well,
instead of using Twitter?
yeah. Facebook is much more secretive than or restrictive than Facebook.
Okay.
It's possible to scrape and to get Facebook posts, but not necessarily to collect information about who posted, or in fact, whether it was a repost or that person's own post, right? So that goes to, so there have been analyses, and they can tell you a lot about content, but most of the work that we do involves an interest in or an analysis of subgroups of, let's say, not all Facebook posts are individuals. They could be organizations and groups and so on. But we're interested in the characteristics of those individuals. And that's the problem of doing subgroup analysis. We're not very good at that yet.
Okay. And the same thing applies to other media. I mean, Instagram or Snapchat or other.
Yeah, I mean, this is not an area of expertise of mine, but I would say that if we talk about the concept of self-selection, why do you choose to use the platform? That's really at the heart of the representativeness question. Who are these people that use this platform and disseminate information?
Okay.
About themselves or about others?
Yeah. A field in progress.
Yes.
I think so. Thank you very much.
And in that regard, Mike, what are the concerns? What should we be concerned about? Are there things that could move potentially in the wrong direction in the survey industry now that we're seeing the emergence of newer survey methods, social media polls, etc., that are being now reproduced by main media outlets? What's the risk in there?
Well, if we make a distinction and you don't believe that it's false between attitudes and behavior, some of these other sources could produce predictive models of behavior that would be quite good. Like car purchases, right? Or interest in certain kinds of food and so on, based upon the photographs that are posted on the Facebook site. But they won't be as good for measuring attitudes about policy or other groups in society and so on. So I guess I would describe this as domain-specific utility, without making it sound like a highfalutin concept, right? But they have domain-specific utility depending on why you are collecting the data for what kind of analysis, right? And many of them will work reasonably well even with external validation at an aggregate level. But we might really be interested in this, again, by subgroups, and we can't extract that information straightforwardly.
Thank you, Mike. Are there any, seeing that I don't have other questions from the group, are there any last thoughts that you would like to share with us? Mike, you've been incredibly generous with your time today, and we all have learned a lot from your insights. Would you like to offer some last thoughts in your presentation today?
Well, I would just say that, going back to George Gallup, there was a sense of the importance of collecting opinions in between elections and campaigns and disseminating them widely, both for the sake of educating fellow citizens about what others thought, but also communicating to the government. We need to work hard to maintain confidence in polling as a method and as a communication device. It's getting increasingly complicated, partly because the world has become more contentious. That's really the implication of polarization in the United States, although it's occurring, in other parts of the world as well. So we're going to have our work cut out for us. And people who study the methods and also public opinion are going to be very important intermediaries in this process.
Thank you, Mike. Really a pleasure having you here today. Thank you to the organizers. Gracias a los organizadores. Un placer haber contado con la presencia de Mike el día de hoy. Los organizadores tienen ahora planeado pasar un video con un resumen de las actividades que han ocurrido en este semestre organizadas por la cátedra, un ejercicio que fue iniciativa de nuestro querido doctor Meyer, que nos acompañará desde donde quiera que esté, seguramente muy contento de vernos aquí activos participando. Entonces, bueno, regreso la transmisión a los compañeros de la producción para que nos hagan favor de pasar este video, y con esta presentación, con esta conferencia del día de hoy del doctor Michael Traugott, se concluye el ciclo de este semestre, que cubre hasta el mes de junio, y pronto los organizadores estarán ya pensando en las actividades para el siguiente semestre a partir de julio. Mike, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to have you here today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. This concludes the activities for the current semester. Organizers are going to now start planning activities for future presentations in the upcoming semester. Anyways, thank you all. Gracias a todos y que tengan una buena tarde.
Quiero mencionar que siempre los proyectos empiezan con una ilusión, imaginándonos un poco lo que podría llegar a ser un proyecto de estas características. El proyecto tiene como propósito iniciar un gran movimiento a favor de los estudios de opinión pública en México, encontrar este diálogo entre los especialistas que trabajan en el mundo profesional, los académicos, los que están trabajando en colaboración con las empresas demoscópicas, influir en la formación de nuevos profesionales, también en la capacitación de los que ya están en el mercado de trabajo, en síntesis, en tratar de hacer del estudio de la opinión pública un referente social, un referente nacional, un componente importante de las decisiones políticas, de las decisiones institucionales. Consideramos importante que los especialistas, los que estamos estudiando el tema de la opinión pública, abramos este espacio de deliberación y obviamente influyamos en el debate público que se está generando. Independientemente de las personas, creo que es de todos. Este es un proyecto incluyente en el cual todos podemos aportar, todos podemos considerar que es nuestro. Siempre los logros son colectivos. Quiero agradecerles a todos su tiempo, su disposición, su apoyo, y pues muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros el día de hoy. Nos despedimos y gracias a todos, y un aplauso y un abrazo desde aquí a todos ustedes. Muchísimas gracias. A todos ustedes, muchísimas gracias por la confianza.
Para mayor información y contenido de la Cátedra Internacional de Opinión Pública, suscríbete a nuestro canal y síguenos en nuestras redes.